We start today's show with the extraordinary war of words between Boris Johnson and Nigel Farage. And the former Prime Minister branded Mr Farage morally repugnant for claiming that the West had provoked Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine. But today, the Reform UK leader has hit back with gusto, pointing out that Mr Johnson blamed the European Union himself for the war of words back in 2016. It's fair to say there have been absolutely no punches pulled. And to discuss that now, I'm joined in the studio by Ben Habib, the Deputy Leader of Reform UK. Ben Habib, an extraordinary war of words has broken out. Boris kicked off by calling Nigel Farage morally repugnant, nauseating, accusing him of ahistorical drivel, Kremlin propaganda. Today, in Maidstone, Kent, Nigel Farage steamed in, calling Boris Johnson the worst Prime Minister in modern British history. Ben Habib, surely that's a touch too much. That's a step too far.
It's a very crowded field identifying who the worst Prime Minister in British history should be, given what we've had over the last 27 years. You know, there's Theresa May vying for the position, there's Rishi Sunak, Tony Blair and others. But I think it was very, very unwise of Boris Johnson to enter this debate. Principally, of course, because he said pretty much exactly what Nigel has just said about the EU in 2016, which, by the way, is right. The EU was flirting with Ukraine. It was offering it associate membership of the European Union, offering it 10 billion euros in funding. And when Yanukovych turned that down under pressure from the Kremlin, there were riots on the streets of Ukraine and a democratically elected leader was deposed. 6 months later, Russia came and took Crimea. And there was at least a linkage in the order of events. And it would be surreal not to call out the EU on it. And Boris called them out in 2016, but it seems now that Boris has reversed his position. It suited him in 2016 to call them out because he was fighting for Brexit. He wanted to have a crack at the EU. And with all the moral correctitude with which we associate with Boris, he's come out and changed his position yet again. And Nigel is absolutely right. Boris is a liar and a hypocrite. If his lips are moving, if his keyboard is moving, if his keys on his keyboard are moving, he's probably lying. And I'll tell you why. I mean,
but Boris would disagree with that. You know, let's keep this.
Yeah, but let me tell you, he has made a major impact on my life. I'm sporting a badge which says no sea border on it. It's because I'm fighting for the union of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, something he said was sacrosanct, Boris Johnson said was sacrosanct, and then turned his back on it with the withdrawal agreement and the Northern Ireland Protocol. And I have had to give up 5 years of my life to fight this battle that Boris Johnson said would never have to be fought. He said the country would leave the EU as one united kingdom. He lied. That's a fundamental lie. But he's lied again. But this is another question, actually, which I want to ask about Boris, which Nigel hasn't hit on. How much money has Boris made out of the Ukrainian war?
Let's not get into that. Well, in fact, Ben Habib, before we go on, can we please listen to the video of Nigel Farage earlier on?
So it's me. I'm the bad guy. And I'm all over the front page of the Daily Mail for daring to stand by what I said all those years ago. And overnight, their most famous columnist, no doubt their best paid columnist, a man called Boris Johnson, has said that I am morally repugnant for suggesting this might have been a causal factor in this appalling war that has now got perhaps nearly 1 million dead and wounded and shows no sign of changing. Well, let's have a little look at something, guys, shall we? Here is Boris Johnson. Daily Mail, are you watching? Here is Boris Johnson from 2016. This is what Boris said. Boris blames the European Union for war in Ukraine.
So as we can see there, Ben Habib, just echoing your earlier point that Boris Johnson had actually said something similar in 2016 about blaming the EU for the war in Ukraine. But back to this election, why now? Why do you think Boris Johnson has entered the fray, or has he been deployed by CCHQ? There are rumours that Boris Johnson will get involved in this general election, and he's gone straight for the throat of Nigel Farage. But in typical Nigel Farage manner, he hasn't pulled his punches. He's roared straight back.
Yeah, well, I think Rishi Sunak is labouring under the pressure of having absented himself early from D-Day, and then this betting scandal, which is still unfolding. And I think he thought he could put in the big dog, or whatever the expression is about Boris Johnson, put in the big dog to take down Nigel. But Boris's record on just about everything is not clean. And Boris, as we say, as we all know, pivots from one position to another. And they should have done their due diligence on what he said before. And Nigel's absolutely right to call Boris out on this. And I have to ask, what is Boris's ideological obsession with Ukraine? He has changed his position. He sold the UK down the drain. He put a border down the Irish Sea. He told us we'd get Brexit, but he gave us 2 new treaties. Why is he obsessed with Ukraine? Why does he do it? But anyway, coming back to the election, it's spectacularly backfired, because here you have the king of sleaze backing up Rishi Sunak, whose cabinet and supporters and campaign managers and everyone else, it would appear, are placing bets on an early election. The whole thing stinks, doesn't it, Martin?
But what about the fact that this guy that you're now putting both barrels into, I mean, you backed Boris Johnson's agreement. 80-seat majority was handed to Boris Johnson by Nigel Farage, standing down over 300 candidates in 2019. Do you think Nigel Farage now is regretting that?
I've regretted it from the day that we did it, because we knew that the withdrawal agreement wasn't good. But the argument that was made in 2019, early 2020, was the British people have voted Boris Johnson in. This is the deal that Boris Johnson promoted to the British people. We, the Brexit Party, fought for Brexit. We fought for democracy. It was not for us to stand against the deal that the British people had approved. But I did say at the time, and you said and many others said, that we will hold Boris to account for the promises he made on page 5, I can still remember, of the Conservative manifesto, which included the country leaving the EU as one United Kingdom, taking back control of our cash, our fish, our borders and everything else. And the reason Reform UK exists, the reason Nigel is back on the public stage, is because Boris broke those promises. He let immigration rip. Instead of championing the British economy, he's hitched us into this net zero nutcase agenda, which is doing so much damage to the welfare of average Brits right across the country, not to mention our private sector and businesses. He's hollowed out the country through his premiership. So Nigel is absolutely right about what he says, being a liar and hypocrite, and he's right to put him up there. I mean, for me, it's a close call between Tony Blair and Boris Johnson on who's the worst prime minister in modern British history. But Boris has got to be up there. Squandered an 80-seat majority, didn't make the country independent, and has delivered the country into peril.
What would you say to those people who even today are saying, quite simply, a supermajority is coming, and that will be because of Reform UK? You're going to be splitting the vote, as they call it, taking away the Conservative vote, allowing a bigger and bigger Labour majority, and the Conservative Party, many people out there who voted Brexit, are saying, the Reform Party are simply handing Starmer massive power to do whatever he wants for the years to come, and you'll have your fingerprints on that.
I will not have any of my fingerprints on it. The people who are responsible for delivering Labour into office, the people who are responsible for Reform UK existing, are the Conservative Party, and we exist, and the Labour Party is in all likelihood going to become the next government because of the failures of the Conservative Party, principally because it is neither Conservative nor Unionist. It is not the Conservative and Unionist Party. It is a globalist, anti-British party. That's what it's become. It governs through the global prism. It is Rishi Sunak is more interested in the G7, the UN, the World Economic Forum, the WHO, than he is in domestic British policy. We know that because of the policies he's passed, including the supporting net zero the way that he does. What we need is a party, and there is only one, which actually stands for British interests first and for British citizens' interests first. And there is only one party that does it, it is Reform UK. And you've got to vote with your conscience.
Well, what would you say then to the fact that you have an admirer today, Vladimir Putin, is putting press out in Russia, calling Nigel a principled politician, speaking with balance? Is that really the sort of person that Reform wants on your side, Vladimir Putin?
I hold Vladimir Putin in contempt. his invasion of Ukraine is contemptible. Whatever the provocation, he should never have done it. Russia is responsible for great instability across the globe. But here's the thing. So are we, by the way, Martin. Our interventions in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, Egypt, these have all been disastrous interventions by the British government, led originally by Tony Blair, and then the heir to Blair, David Cameron. A lot of the illegal migration that we're seeing in Europe comes from those two people. And Boris Johnson had the opportunity to change direction, to change away from all of that, from the interventions of the past, and make the United Kingdom a strong, independent, proud, sovereign country. And he shirked the greatest opportunity this country had for prosperity. And I will never forgive him for that, including putting a border down the Irish Sea. An absolutely repugnant act.
Ben Habib, certainly pulling no punches. Thank you for joining us in the studio. Ben Habib from Reform UK.